It's been over 7 years. Over 7 years since the war that showed all of the universe that humanity is truly the greatest ambush predator. They have never been faced militarily since. No one wants to even think about trying them, as they believe that human ships will simply show up out of nowhere and shoot them point blank range and send them falling into the gravity well of their own home planets. Because of this, everyone worried that humanity would expand beyond its borders, but humanity didn't. They stuck with their own borders, yet they expanded in another way. This was commerce. You see, once everyone saw that humanity was great engineers and what they had done to alter their own selves to make them better, they believed that this alteration is what made them the ambush predators they've become today. Well, they're not exactly wrong, but they're not exactly right either. Though the commerce and negotiations for that sort of technology were underway for a long time before humanity actually allowed them to have even a fifth of a percent of what was available. They needed recovery to go out to everyone else. Recovery from the war meant that commerce was going to flow exceptionally well. The rebuilding process among several species across several planets and sectors was going to take a very long time, and everyone knew this. Though, of course, everyone wanted to grow militarily, they knew the best they had was to have their own instructors, human instructors, to teach them how to fight the way humans do, to fight to absolutely win. And of course, this type of footing is what made their enemies retreat back into their own territories and have to pay a certain amount of reparations for the damages. However, this just made them recoil into their own territories even more, as they feared an incursion from humanity once again, but they also want to strengthen from any other species that might be out for a little bit of retribution. This is what made them fear the most. They believed that if the human allies had gotten hold of humans' tech, that they would go in and force the enemy to become the slaves. They didn't want that. Even though they had lost some territory in the disputes, they still wanted to reinforce what they had around their territories. Anything that faced even the chance that humanity or its allies would come in, entire sectors were abandoned, only sent in with mining equipment to mine the gas giants or to strip some of the planets or asteroid belts, whatever it might be. But no one ever settled. There was a few space stations, but that was it, mostly floating work camps, which nobody wanted to be a part of. However, it is what it is. You lose the war, you end up destroying your own economy in the process. That's the way it's been since time immemorial, and all the Xenos are going to find this out very, very well. Though because of all this paranoia, the human sectors were relatively quiet. And as you look down on one planet, you would think that it was Earth at first glance. It seems like another blue and green ball until you look close and realize that it's not Earth. The oceans are not nearly large enough. They look like giant tributaries. And yet, as you look on the map, you realize where you are. Proxima 3 had been completely terraformed into a sort of business slash vacation hub. The whole planet itself was being used for anybody who wanted to show up and see what Earth was like. But this was as close as anyone was allowed to come to Earth. Even dignitaries would only get this close, as no one was allowed to set foot on Earth if they were not a true blood human. This left many of those who decided to reach out with their own genetic code and intermix it with others to make it a little difficult to return home, if at all possible. This is why shuttles would fly into Proxima 3, and it would be extremely busy. So much so that if it wasn't for the expansive network of control nodes, it's a good chance that many shuttles would clip each other on the way in and out of the planet. Considering the size of those planets, this is something to take into consideration. On the surface, when you see it, it's a very jovial attitude. You see mainly humans work there, along with their worker robots, and a very small amount, but noticeable amount, of Xenos that do work there. Occasionally, you would see a little cove walking around, usually around the beach areas, as they are aquatic, of course. Along with that, you would see the occasional Vunshin as well, but they were used mainly for manual labor, as their ability to climb up and down walls even faster than robots could even think about to get the job done and then scale back down without any problem was, well, something to behold, if nothing else. Then, of course, you have Nishani and everyone's favorite, the Forged. But you didn't see many of them around. The Nishani, of course, since they started to integrate more and more with humanity because their alterations made it very difficult to tell them apart. However, the Nishani were always some sort of shade of blue or purple. This made them easy to be spotted. However, some of the humans decided to alter their own skin pigmentation to give this something similar, as though they were trying to be more Nishani than they were human. No one seemed to care. This seemed to be commonplace, as you look around and saw many humans had altered themselves. Some of them gave themselves wings, some tails. Some of them were a lot taller, some of them too large for the doorways. Other ones decided to make themselves smaller, almost like a halfling or something. Others decided to go full bore, and it seemed like they were mixed between human and dragon. It was an incredibly strange thing to see. It was actually to the point where finding a completely unaltered human on this planet was very difficult to find at all. Inside the bustling areas, you could see kids going out and play as their parents desperately tried to keep them close, but kids need to satisfy their curiosity, especially those that never been on a human planet before. They decide to just go and poke their fingers at everything, even though they were told, watch it, that's going to burn you. Well, sometimes a kid's got to get burned. And then, of course, everyone eventually finds the one place that every human enjoys, that is, settling down at a pool and just relaxing. This is where they met each other, at the hotel itself. And they went to the absolutely massive pool area, mixed with all sorts of hot tubs, swimming pools, hell, a workout area even off on the side, just so somebody could get all sweaty and then cool themselves off, or vice versa. As they sat and talked, Larry and Greknar were with Vince and Femcast as they looked over at their kids playing. This was one sight to behold, as Larry sat there just ripped out of his mind because he had spent most of his off time simply working out. Greknar enjoyed this very much, yet her lanky form was more fit but not exactly cut. She looked as though she was the epitome of femininity, even though her ears and tail, along with the long mane of red hair that strayed down, just kind of gave away her inhuman heritage, which no one seemed to mind at all, especially considering. Next to them, of course, having their own drinks at the poolside, was Vince, who was absolutely shredded. Being taller than Larry, he just looked like an imposing figure. Although there were other humans that were already altered, and they seemed to be just as fit. It was difficult to find anyone who was not in excellent health thanks to human technology. And of course, right next to him, sipping on her drink, though keeping one eye on her children, of course, was Femcast, as she sipped at that, what they called a cola drink, that would very soon get her so plastered she wouldn't be able to stand. But she didn't care. She liked the fuzzy sensation as she drank it. The only thing that made them all a little off about the entire situation as they spoke was the fact that different cultures wear different things to the pool. In fact, for Femcast and Greknar, it was normal for their children to not wear anything when submerging themselves in water, whether this be a bath or swimming in the pool. Of course, Larry and Vince were a little more concerned about this, yet they still saw that the kids were quite young, and they really didn't have any concept of this. Not to mention, they wanted to get rid of the whole modesty shtick, as they realized that if their kids ever ended up on Earth, this was not going to suit them very well, considering how humanity has gone socially in the past 100 years. As Larry and Vince knocked their beers together before enjoying a nice smooth brew, Gretnar just grinned, sipping on something she just loved called a margarita. She didn't know what was in it. She just knew it tasted very good, though she had to get it without salt. She looked over at her children, and she grinned a little bit, seeing them both enjoying the pool, playing with their new friends. There was John, which was almost the spitting image of her husband, although she looked and she could see that John was going to be a bit taller than Larry just from the way his body shape was. Though even only 6 years old, she could see that his muscle density was a lot thicker than what she expected. Larry told her that was going to be one of the things they had to deal with when it came to mixing genetic codes. You see, she was considered an alpha test. So there's going to be certain issues that they can't see. But because of this, they're actually paid extra simply for their kid's blood sample every couple of years, along with, of course, measurements and things of that nature. She looked over and she could see that John had her hair, at least sort of. It wasn't the deep, deep red of hers. However, it was more of an auburn, where Larry had dark black hair, although she could see the dark black hair on her daughter's head. Shariknar actually looked a lot like her mother. The only difference was the fact that she had jet black fur, and her ears seemed to be slightly large for her size. Larry actually laughed and said, "Don't worry, she'll grow into them. That's something humans do." Gregnar worried about this, but Shariknar didn't seem to care. Although what was surprising was the fact that Shariknar's senses were actually more attuned. Maybe this was another side effect, along with the fact that Shariknar's tail was again large for her size. This was something, again, she hoped her daughter would actually grow into. The kicker of it was, Shariknar, unlike the rest of her kin, could use her tail almost like she was using an arm. This surprised everybody, especially when she actually used it to actually pick things up in front of her grandfather, which surprised the holy hell out of him. At one point, he was about to be mad and call her a freak, but then again was surprised at this and realized that this could be another advantageous thing for their species, so he didn't say anything. Her grandmother, of course, loved this idea and simply kept asking her to pick up other things with her tail and show it off. Well, let's face it, what woman doesn't like to show off? The two were actually twins, as it turns out that the fourth species actually gives birth in packs. It's just a commonplace thing. The fact that she was now human meant that she was limited to two. Having triplets was not going to be common for her. Hell, having just one was not going to be common. This was actually confirmed by several of the geneticists as they checked her out all through the pregnancy, making sure everything was going to go off well, and it did. In fact, she said that giving birth was not nearly as painful as she thought it would be. This surprised everybody, considering both of her children were able to crawl across the floor within just a month. Now, this could be considered normal for a smart human, but for her species, they're expected to crawl within just a week. So she was worried after a week if they had fallen behind, but as it turns out, they had more of her genetic code than they thought. Looking at Shariknar, it was clear to see that she was going to be a beauty, even though her brother was going to be a complete hulk of a man. She looked at her daughter and was extremely proud of the fact that they helped produce something like this. She looked over and she could see as her daughter played how she was extremely flexible, how she was able to leap so far, even though she didn't have retractable claws like her mother does, at least on the feet. And yet, she was still able to just move around so well. As they looked over, they could also see Vincent Femcast's kids, who took to the pool very quickly, which was not surprising considering Femcast, her species, is partly aquatic. As it turned out, every single one of their kids can submerge and breathe underwater, which drove the twins absolutely crazy because the twins kept having to come up for air, and of course, Vince's kids took after him and would constantly kind of give her a tug on her tail, or at least tap it, just enough to make her turn and spin around, curse at them a little bit, and then dive back down as they chased each other in a strange game of tag. Femcast also looked at her kids with a smile, if nothing else. She looked and she saw her oldest, Lisa, 7 years old. As it turns out, Femcast either got pregnant right before the battle or on the way there, on the way back. They had a lot of time to kill, and they killed it the best way they could find. The kicker is, she believed that she was only feeling some strange sensations, and then believed the same thing would happen the first time, as the first time her pregnancy didn't take. And at one point, it almost broke her. She didn't tell anyone. The only one who actually knew was the doc, who actually told her that she had started to develop, and then nothing. She thought this was going to be the standard. So when Lisa was born, she was extremely happy. Lisa is again the spitting image of her mother, though she seemed to be more broader a little bit. Her muscle tone was definitely much more noticeable in comparison to Femcast. Femcast was extremely slick, extremely feminine, and definitely didn't have much fat on her. Lisa didn't have fat on her either, but it was clear that she would have much better definition in her muscles. Almost as much as her second child, Tommy, 5 years old. He looked a lot like Vince. The only difference was the fact that no hair, of course, since none of her children have hair. And he just seemed like a bald kid that seemed a little blue, but not depressed. He seemed to not even care about it. The fact that he had human ears definitely helped out. If you put a baseball cap or some sort of hat on his head, you'd be hard pressed to tell him from any other child, except for the fact that, again, he looks a little blue, but still not depressed. The last one was there in the shallow end, kind of playing with the other children. Femnique was only 3 years old, so she had to be monitored very, very closely. She again looked very similar to her mother. The only difference is it was clear to see that she was not going to have a lot of definition like her older sister. She was going to be extremely lean. Even though she had the little bit of baby weight on her, it was fading rather quickly. So, as they looked over, that made 5 children in just a few years, and the parents were extremely proud and happy that they were turning out the way they were. As they watched, they saw how a few of the boys seemed to stare a little bit at the girls, even though John and his sister Shariknar had seen each other in this state before. It was very common for the boys to look at other species of girls with a bit of curiosity. And that was all. It was also common for the females to do the same, but just not as brazen about it. Usually, at least the aquatic girls would go under the water and sit there and stare and have to use a bit of hand signals, as they did not have the Nashani way of communicating underwater, a trait that Femcast was actually understandably a little put back that they didn't have. It was a type of echolocation. Even though they could figure out where they were without their eyes open, it was usually used for some sort of communication as well, not just location. As the 4 sit there and watch the kids play with one eye, they talk about what happened in the last 7 years. Larry has been an instructor still at the academy, dealing mainly in human cultures, military tactics, and ethics. Vince kept saying, "Ethics? Seriously? Along with military tactics? Come on, really? No, come on." Of course, Larry and Vince being friends for so long, he knew how Vince joked around, and he was just trying to get a rise out of Larry, which honestly, he didn't give a crap anymore. He just swigged his drink and just kept on going. They talked about Gretnar, how she turned into an emissary due to the fact that she is the daughter of the highest pride leader. And of course, the fact that she's been altered a bit really helps out with communications between the forced and human, more than anyone would understand. Though the kicker is, she kept bringing her children with her as much as possible so they could understand the universe itself. But this was more along the lines of the fact she didn't want to stop being a wife and mother, even though Larry kept saying, I'll watch over the kids. Let me have a weekend. You go, you have fun. You go relax. Asking a mother to let go of the kids when they're only 6 years old is a losing battle, and he learned that very, very quickly. Vince, on the other hand, was over at the Nishani Military Academy while he continued to be the head instructor. He designed everything, not only how they trained, the schedule, and everything else. He was able to work in the past 7 years exactly how to maximize the Nishani so that they could actually defend themselves this time if there ever was another incursion into their space. With this, he kept saying how it was difficult to tell them apart sometimes. This confused the hell out of Larry, but he didn't understand what was going on until Vince just kind of yelled out, You can't tell the men from the women sometimes. Larry immediately looked over at Femcast, and she just kind of smirked and gave a human nod. What? Seriously? With that, even Greknar stopped looking at the kids, turned at the two, and went, Huh? Yeah, it's true. Sometimes you can't tell till they lose their pants. And then, of course, the constant ripping from Larry this time ensued, which pretty much boiled down to him constantly saying one line, It's a trap! With this, Vince kept getting more and more pissed off, but he didn't care. He was there with his family, he was there with a cool drink in his hand, and he was on vacation. He didn't give a shit. All he knew is it took up a lot of his time, and he wanted to devote a lot of his time to being a husband and a father, too. Definitely he devoted some time to be a husband. I mean, come on. They got 3 kids. He was devoting time and genetic material. Femcast was mainly devoted on being a wife and mother, considering her children were such spread out in age. She actually complimented on how Greknar was able to have the twins and just not have to worry about getting pregnant ever again. At least, not for a few years. Greknar got a little mad and wanted to know how Femcast actually knew about that. Femcast simply looked over at Vince and kind of pointed. Why did you tell her? He just turned to Larry. Why did you tell me? Then, of course, Larry looked at Greknar and was like, We're friends, we talk. With that, Greknar had to explain that, again, since she was an alpha test, there was a few bugs in the system. The fact of the matter is, her getting pregnant was a shot in the dark. The fact that she had actually gone into heat was the only dead giveaway that she could get pregnant. But the kicker was they weren't sure if she was going to go into heat again. Judging by her genetic material, the actual scientists tried to figure it out, and they said, by the look of things, you might only go into heat once every decade or so. With that, Greknar was a little put back as the best together time she had with her husband was when she was in heat. He actually joked with her and kept saying, Yeah, it's like having sex when you're high. Yeah, it's going to feel a bit better. But at least it doesn't hurt, right? With that, she kind of rolled her eyes and smiled and said, Yeah, it's the farthest from hurt. And with that, of course, the two ladies started giggling and decided that they would walk off for their own drinks. Though women always think they're being clever when they do this, men always know, hey, we want to talk about the guys, but we don't want them to hear it. And of course, as they sat there at the bar giggling with themselves, the guys simply looked and went, jeez, and just went on to something else. The subject actually changed back to Vince and Larry talking about the way they grew up and the fact that most of the Xenos, including their own kids and wives, have this thing about lack of attire. It was still confusing them about that, but then again, wearing clothing was almost exclusively a human thing. Gregnar, before her change, only had a belt with a sort of sash attached to it. It was almost like a harness when you looked at it, just enough that a few pieces of cloth draped down in one or two areas, but that was more for hygiene purposes than anything else. With that, they actually looked over at Femcast and realized that the Nishani were the same thing. They didn't wear a whole lot. In fact, Larry commented on how when they met in the academy, he wondered if Femcast had just kind of stopped getting dressed halfway. Turned out it was just a social thing, and now they're just trying to let their kids know about this. Along with that is the fact they will have less difficulty dealing with other species and other races, especially once they understand the basic outer biology of each species. Even as they said that, they even motioned over to a Vuncian that was overdoing a little bit more maintenance. It seemed as though the Vuncian, being the fact that they're partly insectoid, really didn't like being around the water much. Though they would drink it, of course, they didn't like to swim, which was kind of weird because they looked like they were part lizard, too. This confused them both, but they decided not to push the subject. They were trying to decide whether they should bring up the subject to the wives, and eventually Vince said, fuck it, we're on vacation. Let the kids have fun. Of course, being the fact that they were little kids, this was innocent fun. They didn't worry about any of that crap, and the kids were playing games, so whatever. Just let them burn themselves out so they can have dinner later without any problems. Later at dinner, they were having a little bit of difficulty with the children, but let's face it, when you bring 3 and 5-year-olds to a fancy restaurant, you're going to have some issues. Kids get bored easy. It's what it is. However, with a little bit of instruction and, of course, incentive by letting the kids know that if they are good, they're going to go to the amusement park the next day, that got them to sit there, not raise too much hell. Of course, the boys started to try and show a little bit of dominance against each other, but that got squished really quick. The boys were told that they're basically going to be brothers. They looked at each other confused because they're not even the same species. How can they be brothers? And of course, Larry and Vince were quick to remind them that they're part human. And humans pack bond with each other. It's what they do. It's just part of them. It's in their genetic code. Don't bother fighting it because it's still there. And with that, they're going to want to protect the girls because that's in their DNA as well. They can't shake it. The boys looked at each other confused and tried to talk amongst each other, trying to figure out what was going on. The ladies tried to jump in to explain everything, but thankfully, Larry and Vince simply said, no, they'll let them figure it out for themselves. They'll get it eventually. Just don't push the subject anymore. The next day at the amusement park, they had to make sure that the kids actually had the appropriate attire, as you really don't want to go laying your bare butt on a roller coaster when you're, getting pushed sideways, up, down, left, right, because you'll end up with bruises on your butts. That could ruin a day really quick. The ladies, unfortunately, had a little bit of problems with the roller coaster. Greknar and Shreknar were both having to tuck their tails in, and they found out really quick, don't sit on your tail, especially on a roller coaster. Once they went up and slammed down, and Shriknar ended up screeching in pain, she ended up sitting there just constantly rubbing her tail for a good 10 minutes when she got off of the ride. She did not enjoy that. Although everybody did like the old-fashioned log rides and all that other fun stuff. There was, of course, the teacups, which, of course, Vince and Larry looked at each other with a mischievous grin. The ladies couldn't figure out why and kept asking, why do you guys look like that? Why are you showing your teeth? You two look like you're up to something. They didn't say anything, but as soon as the ride started, they both grabbed a hold of the center and started to spin those teacups as fast as they could. Most of the boys were screaming, faster, faster! And the girls were sitting there just trying to keep their dinner down, even though they were laughing so hard they couldn't even stand it. By the time they got off, the youngest of them, Femnique, Tommy, and Shreknar, had to be carried off. They were in no condition to walk. John and Lisa, however, they were more than willing to go again, and this time they wanted both of the guys to be spinning that center console at the same time. They were told that was a bad idea, considering they almost got in trouble because they were spinning the teacups too fast. Of course, at that point, they had no idea what teacups were, nor did they care. All they knew is, let's do that again! A couple of the rides were, of course, too large for some of the young ones to go on. Unfortunately, Femnique was definitely too small, being only 3 years old. She could go on some of the smaller rides, of course, but she had to be carried by Femcaster Vince the whole time. She didn't enjoy that much. However, what kid does not enjoy fair food? However, they learned real quick that a high amount of grease does not do so well for the Nishani, even though anybody who's part forced has absolutely no problem with it. However, on the other part of that, an extremely high amount of carbs was not something that the forced could handle. The Nishani, however, could eat that like there was no tomorrow. So each of them learned something really quick about what they could and couldn't eat at the fairgrounds. Either way, their parents were laughing hysterically at their plight. They didn't understand why the parents were doing this, but in all honesty, half the parents were nauseous themselves just watching their kids run over to the bushes and upchuck their lunch. It was kind of a strange dance. When they actually went back to the hotel, they actually were able to meet their old friend Jenny by the pool. That way they could talk about new events. Jenny brought her child as well, though by looking at them you wouldn't be able to tell. Her daughter Annie was full-blood human and definitely looked the part. She looked almost exactly like Jenny did when she was younger. I mean, freakishly so. Except it seemed as though Annie was a bit more, say, active. See, Jenny was rather short, but they could tell that Annie, unless she stopped growing early, was going to be able to be very, very tall, something similar to the way Lisa was going to be. However, the one thing that stood out was the fact that Jenny had decided to alter herself a little bit. She now was sporting a set of angel wings that sat on the small of her back. She loved the idea of flapping up and just getting a running start and taking to the skies. She tried for a while to convince the guys that they should do alterations to themselves, but neither Larry nor Vince had any interest in changing themselves. If they got it any bigger, as Vince would say, "If I got any bigger, I wouldn't be able to even hold my wife." Looked over there and realized that Femcast, as soon as they said bigger, she had a look on her face of, please God, no. So Jenny simply dropped the subject, though she would constantly be flicking her wings, more as a nervous tick or as something she was just getting used to. Not really to shake water off or anything like that, but that sure as hell what it looked like. They were talking for a while as the kids continued to play in the pool and burn off the energy from all the junk food they had eaten that day. Along with that, they had to make sure the kids didn't either puke in the pool or end up urinating in it, which is something they had to constantly warn the kids about. Annie, being 3 years old, she could sit there and play with Feminique as much as she wanted. This actually helped out a lot because Femnique was, well, a little bored with the fact that she was the only one out of the 5 kids that were there that was stuck by herself, basically in the kiddie pool. But now she has a friend. As Jenny talked with everybody, they were talking about current events, and Jenny brought up the fact, since she is kind of a commerce emissary type of job, she heard that their former enemies wanted to talk. Everybody wondered what the hell they wanted to talk about. And everybody started to wonder if it was the fact that their enemies, their former enemies, still had folks in the academy. The academy, being on neutral territory, didn't recognize the war. And being that way, it turns out that the Zeknekel and, of course, the Keltipsian were still there. However, it seemed as though they were interested in more and more human things. They couldn't figure out what was going on. The Zeknekel, they kept talking about how they wanted to adapt to the changing times. People worried what this was all about, though the Keltipsian seemed a lot more secretive. They did focus a lot more on their engineering and were starting to pump out better ships as they did before. Their commerce ships, i.e. cargo ships, seemed to have much, much better engines. Some of them even were stroking some sort of armaments on the outside, though this was told to be mainly defensive, A lot of people worried about this considering their history, though they didn't pay it too much mind, as a single human destroyer could take out half of their fleet without them even knowing. The Zeknekel, everyone didn't know about them. Being the reptilian species, they were just kind of off. Sometimes they were secretive, sometimes they would jump and just yell at you and give everything away. Nobody understood anything about that, but it was just strange that both of these species were starting to reach out, but they were trying to get more and more information. Not wanting to bring down the mood, everybody started drinking. And because of this, the kids got some extra time at the pool, burning off so much energy that they all had to be carried up to their rooms and tucked in, but they were tucked in late. However, there was a small issue that the parents had to deal with. It didn't matter if it was Vincent Femcast. It didn't matter if it was Larry and Gregnar. They needed to find a quiet place away from the kids. You see, you don't have a body like Femcast or Gregnar and strut it around half the day in front of your husband and not expect some sort of repercussions. And these percussions that ended up happening made it to the point that in a few cases security was called. Even though once security realized what was going on, they couldn't stop laughing and would just tell everybody, don't worry, the noises will stop soon. Jen, on the other hand, decided that she was going to go to one of the clubs and get out her frustrations out there. No one saw her till the next morning. Of course, everybody knew she was going to be okay, as Proxima 3 was one of the safest places you could be outside of Earth. Security there was incredible, and they did not take any shit. Later on, at the end of the vacation, the girls were actually talking, and both of them said the same thing. I think he was trying to get me pregnant again. The guys just happened to be close enough to overhear this. Both of them had to turn away as they both started snickering at the idea, with their kids looking up and saying, What's so funny? I didn't hear it. In that simple, innocent look that all kids have. With that, they began to part ways and everyone went back to their designated spots. Jen went back to her Commerce Guild. Larry and Femcast went over to Femcast home planet so they could continue training. And of course, Larry and Gregnar went back to the academy so classes could begin again. They all took their children, who were still exhausted from the entire weekend. Larry, as soon as he sat down, looked over and saw that his kids and his wife were all sleeping off the vacation. He saw that strange grin on her face and goes, oh, geez, again? Remembering that, thanks to her adjustments, her dreams, when it comes to the Force, will simply repeat a lot of the things that happened the day prior. It was almost as though it was recapping everything. But with the grin on her face, he knew what she was thinking about, which made him laugh. A good thing, too, because as soon as he opened up his transcript device, he realized that there was a message on there. It simply stated, See me immediately upon return. This was coming straight not only from the Chancellor, but also from the human delegation. He realized that whatever was going on had to be bad if he's getting the same message from everyone else. All he was thinking was, oh, now what? As he got close to his ship, he simply gave the command, On Goof, awaken! And once again, the ship seemed to appear out of nowhere, and the shuttle simply moved over to the bay. He didn't wake up his wife until they landed successfully. He continued to look over the messages, and they all said the same thing. We need to talk immediately. Something's going on. Well, I guess vacation's over.